I just want to emphasize that the piece of this case that we look at for the DA's office is the situation immediately surrounding the officer's decision to shoot. And in this case, the officer who was extended up through the roof hatch, and the purpose for that was getting the best possible view of the front door of Mr. Babb's house. When Mr. Babb brought the rifle to bear on him so that the officer could actually see the hole in the end of the barrel, the officer fired. And I know what most people have wanted to talk about is the circumstances that preceded the officer being in that situation. And unfortunately, I'm not, that's sort of beyond the scope of our inquiry. We've collected the information, but that's not something that I should be commenting on. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn this over to the detectives so that they can give you a very brief summary overview, and then if you have questions, we'll do our best to answer them.
We'll just briefly go over what we discovered during our investigation on March 30th when the EdFit team responded to the shooting. And that's that at approximately 5:06 p.m. on the 30th, Eugene Police Department received a 911 phone call from a counselor who advised that she was working with a client who was a veteran from Afghanistan who had suffered PTSD as well as a severe traumatic brain injury, and that client was in crisis at the time, and had told her that he had armed himself with a 9mm pistol and had actually fired the weapon inside the house, and had also made threats of harming himself. That information was relayed to 911, and officers responded for a welfare check at the address of 2248 DeVos Street. When officers arrived on scene, which is approximately 5:13 p.m., the officers could see that tactically this was a fairly dangerous situation for them to try to walk into. Some of these pictures to the right kind of demonstrate what it was that the officers could see. This picture to the far right shows the driveway as you face back towards the residence. The residence is only partially seen here because it sits back behind all the other houses. So as officers responded to this location and more information was learned about the danger of Mr. Babb inside the home, having a gun, having fired a shot, and there possibly being a roommate also inside the house, it was determined that probably the safest way to approach the house was to use an armored vehicle so that officers could actually get closer to the residence, put eyes on the residence. At approximately 5:40 p.m., the armored vehicle arrived on scene and was parked in a driveway next to the residence. And within that armored vehicle was also a crisis negotiator from the SWAT team who started loud hailing using the PA system to make contact with Mr. Babb inside the residence. They made several attempts to encourage Mr. Babb to exit the residence. There was no success with those attempts. At approximately 5:43 p.m., the roommate that was living in the residence with Mr. Babb exited the residence and was immediately brought to the armored vehicle, which was close by, so that those officers could interview him quickly and determine what the situation inside the residence was. They learned from the roommate that Mr. Babb was inside the residence attempting to open a large safe that had several high-powered rifles and other firearms in the safe. There was a lot of discussion at that point as far as trying to determine what the best way to reach a peaceful solution or outcome to this event was. Part of that discussion was whether or not we could extend the perimeter and that the officers could actually back up and try to de-escalate the situation. Contact was made with Mr. Babb via telephone with the crisis negotiator. Mr. Babb ended that conversation by hanging up the phone, and shortly after that, at approximately 5:52, the officer who was in the top hatch of that armored vehicle, who had a view of a portion of the top of the front door, which, if you can look, this picture here demonstrates basically the view from inside the armored vehicle. The armored vehicle has a video camera that points out the front that's just to the right of the driver. So this is a little bit lower, approximately 18 inches lower than the view that the officer in the top hatch would have of the front door. The officer who was watching the front door from the top hatch observed a male subject come to the front door and shoulder a rifle and point it at him, and at that point realized that his only option to defend himself was to stop the threat, which he did. He fired one shot. Mr. Babb dropped out of sight and was no longer visible because of the fences that are in front of the house. There was a lot of discussion at that point as far as the officers trying to determine in that dynamic situation if that was a shot fired by the subject inside the house or if that was a shot fired by the officer. Approximately 4 minutes later, they determined that nobody had a view on Mr. Babb, so they were unsure if he was actually injured, if he had ducked out of sight, and so, or if he was maybe moving to a different position in the house. So they approached the house in that armored vehicle by driving through those fences, and as they arrived in front of the house, they observed Mr. Babb lying in the doorway, and that rifle that he had been pointing was laying on the front porch. Officers immediately responded to Mr. Babb and determined that he was deceased. Medics were called to respond who had been staged nearby. Those medics responded immediately and confirmed that Mr. Babb was deceased.